Antietam Battlefield, and a body found on Bloody Lane are part of a new mystery by Lee W. Doty. And last, Casualty, the topic of Zoom into books today. Lee Doty is an award-winning author and a retired attorney and divides her time between Massachusetts and West Virginia. She teaches writing in the Shepherd University Lifelong Learning Program, and we are so happy to welcome her to Zoom into books today. Welcome, Lee, and please tell us about your background and what got you started writing.
Thank you very much, Kathy, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad you are able to attend today. Let me tell you a little bit about myself. I am a retired lawyer. I started out my career in Washington, D.C. I worked in-house at Children's Hospital and ultimately became the general counsel there. And from there, my family moved to Philadelphia, where I was a lawyer in a large firm. And finally, I went out on my own and had a solo practice. And my husband and I moved to Cape Cod once our children were grown and out. And that is where we remained until our grandchildren came along. And now we're in West Virginia, closer to them. We have between us 5 children and 10 grandchildren. And I think they're holding steady at 10. And we're now living in West Virginia. A little bit about my interest in writing. It started back when my mother, who was a great reader, got the rest of us to read any chance we got. And it was so much fun. It seemed like a simple thing to go from reading to simply writing a book. Well, of course, it isn't that easy. And as I progressed through high school and college, I did want to be a writer, but I felt I just did not have what it took. And so I did what so many people who are worried about becoming a writer. I went to law school instead. That's how I spent the next 35 years. Meanwhile, one of my sisters, a younger sister, did become a writer. And she sort of lived the life that I should have led and wanted to lead. And she made such a success of it, writing in the genre of YA. Her name is Han Nolan. And she was very encouraging to me. And I decided, well, shoot, I ought to try this. And I went back to school. I got my MFA and I began writing, and year after year passed, and I wrote a couple of novels, and they were awful. And but finally, my sister said to me one day, you just have to hang in there. You have to keep on keeping on, because most people will not. And you want to be there and be counted. So keep on writing. And that is exactly what I did. And it took at least 10 years to finally have some success and get a novel published, my first novel through Headline Books called Titlekin. And there is Titlekin. And now I have followed it up with its sequel, Last Casualty. And I'm very glad that in retirement, I've been able to spend my time just so joyfully and productively writing.
Thank you, Lee. I think it's interesting that your sister is an author. How much longer before you started that your book was published?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, did she write at a very early age too?
Yeah, she did, right out of college. And after graduate school, I should say, she began writing. And she stuck with it a good long time, but fairly soon she was picked up and I believe it was Harcourt, called Harcourt at the time, published her first novel. And I believe it was her second novel that won a National Book Award. So she really had some marvelous success, and I think she's got about there. And so she got started right away, unlike me. But the great thing is she has sort of blazed the trail and has been very encouraging along the way. And so I am forever grateful for it. I wish I had gotten started sooner, but I have to say the legal background has been helpful to me as well. So, you know, you can't regret it. I can't regret it.
And most of us love legal thrillers too. You know, we've got Grisham and a lot of
You're right.
You're in good company, that's for sure. Would you like to tell us what Last Casualty is about?
Oh, I'd love to. It's really two stories that intertwine. The main story, the murder mystery, involves a young woman who is found by our heroine, Norma Bergen, along Bloody Lane, which is a road that runs through the battlefield of Antietam. Norma is touring Antietam. She had intended to go on a picnic there and tour. She's a Civil War buff. She was intending to go with her husband and daughter, but they backed out at the last moment, so she's a little bit huffy about that. But she wanders through the fields, realizes she must answer a call of nature, but the ladies' room is too far away. And so she wanders into a thicket nearby, and lo and behold, she finds the murder victim, a young woman, beautiful girl, and discovers that this is somebody that she knows. And so she begins a quest to find the murderer, largely because the murder victim is a friend of her daughter, and her daughter is having a great deal of difficulty accepting what has happened. But the second thread of the story involves Norma and her new family, what she refers to as her instant family. She's in her early 40s. She has married a man, Will Coyne, who also has never been married before. So they're starting out fresh. They have adopted a teenage daughter for reasons that are clear in the first novel, titled Kin. And then they, within short order, they leave their home on Cape Cod, where they have both worked for years, and that's where their roots are. And they transition to West Virginia, where, I mean, could two states be farther apart in all respects than Cape Cod, Massachusetts and West Virginia? But her husband has inherited a horse farm, so they start this new life. And in addition to trying to solve a murder, and what ultimately turns out to be two murders, the family undergoes all sorts of pressures. And so those two areas become intertwined. And so that's really the essence of the book. But there are many difficulties that Norma encounters along the way, largely because she's such a bristly, abrasive personality. It gets her into a lot of trouble.
Yes, it does. I know that your first book is set in the Civil War too. What draws you to Civil War history? And I want to let people know who are watching, the book is present day. It doesn't take place during the Civil War. And also remind those who are watching, if you have questions for the author, please type them in the comment section, or in the chat room in the Zoom room, and Lee will be happy to answer your questions. But tell us how you became interested in the Civil War. And I know this took a lot of research. And tell us about the research process.
Sure. Well, my family is Southern. We're from Alabama and Georgia primarily, and I was born in Atlanta. And believe it or not, at least when I was growing up, the Civil War did not seem so long ago. And in fact, it really doesn't right now. But at the time, you know, it was something that was talked about. All the relatives and my grandparents and so on, I mean, they sort of were still living the Civil War and the heroes and the villains. So that was part of it, but also as I went into college, I majored in history and, you know, read the various famous historians, Shelby Foote and Bruce Caton were big back in the day. And, but then now, here I am in West Virginia, living very close to John Brown's Harper's Ferry. I live right outside Shepherdstown, which was used as a sort of a hospital for the soldiers who were wounded on the battlefield. Shepherdstown also has a cemetery, Elmwood Cemetery, that hosts many of the Confederates who fell at Antietam and were rather unceremoniously removed from the cemetery at the battlefield because they were Confederates, not Union soldiers. It's very difficult to get away from the Civil War, or I feel and also it's just absolutely fascinating, heartbreaking, so much sacrifice, and yet so much triumph too, triumph for the country. As we emerged from the Civil War. So all those things caused me to be very interested in it. As for the research, I'm lucky being so close to Shepherd University, and I was able to consult with this Civil War director there, Professor James Broomall, and he gave me all sorts of guidance and help about the Antietam Battlefield and other elements that I have laced into the story. So those are the ways in which I've focused on the Civil War. The other thing I'd point out is that the battlefield itself is full of mystery. It is so beautiful, so peaceful, and yet the irony of that, so much tragedy, such bloodshed. There's even one of the farms on the battlefield that existed long before the battle was fought there. Has a family cemetery, and I've always wondered about the fact that here are these people were buried so many years before the Civil War actually occurred, and then a battle was fought on top of them at I believe it's the Muma farm. So the battlefield itself is a wonderful place to visit and to contemplate the history of our country and where we are today.
That's so true. I think anybody who has ever set foot on any of those battlefields, you can feel it. You can feel it around you, under you, and over you. That's for sure.
That is the truth.
Tell us about Norma Bergen. She's a likable, unlikable character.
Right, right. Well, you know, it's funny. Every time I have given a talk about title kin initially, and I imagine it will happen as I speak more about Last Casualty, people ask me if Norma, who is this abrasive, bombastic personality, is that me? Did I model her after myself? And that always makes me laugh. I wonder where that's coming from. But in any case, the answer is actually, in some respects, I did draw from my own personality for Norma, just in one respect. Norma makes big mistakes. She goes through life making just many errors, causing harm, doing things that anybody else, if they did them, if I did them, I would just curl up and die from just the sorrow or the humiliation of having done such a foolish thing. Norma is not like that, though. She forges ahead. She keeps on keeping on. And while she may have a momentary an ounce of regret, she keeps on going. And ultimately, she succeeds. And in a strange sort of way, she reminds me of other heroes I have, like Winston Churchill or Abraham Lincoln, who also made gigantic mistakes on a world scale. But somehow they wound up on the right side and wound up doing the right thing, even though some of their mistakes had tragic consequences. So I guess Norma, I guess someone else who I based Norma on in a strange way, people are also surprised when I say this. In my mind, Norma looks like the character Murphy Brown in that TV series that Candice Bergen played the starring role. She's supposed to be lovely, but she hides her beauty in and avoids any sort of personal allure, like Murphy Brown did in her show. And so that's where Norma comes from. And she does not suffer fools gladly. She does not spare people who she finds are cruel or arrogant. She lets them have it. She doesn't hesitate.
Makes for a good heroine, for sure.
Right. Right.
We do have some questions coming in, but before we get to the questions, I'd like for you to read an excerpt.
Okay, sure.
We've talked about what the book's about the main character, and let's have an excerpt, please.
Okay, just a little introduction. This excerpt takes place in the office of the sheriff, and the Sheriff Law is his name. He is Deputy Hogue is also with the sheriff. Now, Deputy Hogue was at the battlefield when Norma discovered the murder victim, and they immediately clashed. Deputy Hogue found it a little bit too much of a coincidence that Norma found the murder victim way out in the battlefield in a thicket, and that Norma knew the murder victim. That was just a little bit too much of a coincidence for him. So now Norma has agreed to come back and be interviewed by the sheriff and Deputy Hogue, who's, as you'll see, she doesn't spare him. What can I do for you, Deputy Hogue? You can start with an explanation of your real relationship with the deceased. As I've already explained, Dell was my daughter's friend, or more precisely, the sister of my daughter's friend. Otherwise, I had no relationship with her. What else do you want to know? And as I've already explained to you, you need to drop the attitude. We know you got into an argument with her about money during dinner just a week ago. Do you argue with all your daughter's friends about money? Does dropping the attitude, my attitude, require answering rhetorical questions like that one? Hogue dropped his arms and pushed off from the wall. Listen here. Sheriff Law tapped his desk loud enough to get our attention. Just tell him about the dinner in your own words, Miss Bergen. Dell had come to dinner uninvited to complain that her parents wouldn't stake her in New York as she pursued her modeling career. She'd had her hand out for money, and I suggested she get a job. I turned to Deputy Hogue. You may call that a fight, but if you call it a murder motive, you obviously don't know what you're doing. Hogue bared his teeth. You better just, Ms. Bergen, we'll finish a lot sooner if you stay on track, Sheriff Law said. No reason to get upset, but we heard you were a lot madder at the deceased than your story now implies. That's all. Who told you that? I thought I knew. We can talk about that later, Sheriff Law said. We're just trying to put the puzzle together. Fine. You'd be better off with an eyewitness account of my dinner conversation with Dell. I assume you got your information from Mrs. Spencer, a grief-stricken mother who wasn't at our dinner and has no idea about the tenor of the conversation. Rest assured, Ms. Bergen, Hogue said, we do have an eyewitness account. Hogue took a moment to smooth out the line of his comb down. Let's put aside your advice on our investigative technique, shall we? You need to cooperate and help us locate your friend, the one you were with at the battlefield. Despite the stories in the news about Dell Spencer's death, he hasn't come forward. What is this with this friend business? He's not my friend. I met the man for the first time during the guide's lecture at Antietam. He sounded like he knew a lot about the Civil War, and I was interested in what he had to say. That's all. Do you expect me to believe you were willing to wander into an isolated area of the park with a stranger? Hogue said. You take me for a fool? Yes. Hogue stepped forward and slammed his hand on Law's desk, triggering a blast of static. Now, Ms. Bergen, Sheriff Law said, you know better than that. I stood to go. I won't answer questions that make no sense. You should be asking for my help in finding that guy. They were both silent, so silent we could even hear through the concrete wall Sheila in reception explaining a form to someone. I wished I hadn't been surly, but these men, especially Hogue, infuriated me. As they merrily rolled along the wrong track, a killer was still on the loose. That thought reminded me I didn't even know the cause of Dell's death, and having antagonized both men, it could be a long time before I did. Look, Sheriff, Detective Hogue, Deputy Hogue, I don't mean to sound hostile. These insinuations about my behavior toward Dell and the man I met on the battlefield are plain mistaken. However, I have just thought of something that may help. Hogue barely nodded for me to go on. I'll tell you, but first I'd like to know something from you. How did Dell die? Give me a break, Hogue said. How's this? Her heart stopped. He looked to Sheriff Law for approval of that witty put down. Have it your way. I headed toward the door. Sit down, Ms. Bergen, Hogue said. I don't think I will, and unless you arrest me, I'm out of here. That's Norma, and that's Hogue.
That's wonderful. I'd like to remind people that Lee did a dialogue workshop on Zoom into Books a few months ago, and that's available on the Zoom into Books Facebook page and the YouTube channel. She's a master at writing dialogue, and that was a great example. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
We have a question from Jenny. Her question is, did you find that writing the second book was harder than the first, that you judged your own writing differently and felt constrained by all you had learned from doing the first one, or was it a more freeing experience?
Oh, that is a great question. That is a great question. Well, of course, it was a mixed bag. It was wonderful to be able to continue my story because I still was living with my characters. I still had Norma with me, and I had left some things open at the end of my last book. I had more things I wanted to develop for Lainey, their daughter. And so I was very glad to have the opportunity to live with them a few more years. But it was hard. In fact, I had this sort of sense of dread about the whole thing the whole time. But one of the technical problems I had was with backstory, trying to figure out how much of the first story I needed to bring forward into the sequel in order for a reader to understand what was happening without rehashing the whole first book. I wanted them to go read the first book. And also, I didn't want to overwhelm the reader with all that exposition. So that was a technical problem that was hard to wrestle with, and I'll let my readers figure out if I got it right. But I was intending for the sequel to be a standalone as well as a sequel. But no, I guess on balance, I'm glad I have had Norma with me a little bit longer, but it was very hard, very hard. That's a great question.
And we have another question, which is a good follow-up from Becky on Facebook. Lee, do you have a third and maybe a fourth book in your future?
Well, I do have a third book in this series that I'm working on right now, because there, while certainly the murder, or I should say murders, get resolved by the end of Last Casualty, there are some elements of the story that I'm thinking that a reader is going to want to know more about. So I'm knee deep into the third volume. As for after that, I will certainly keep writing, but whether Norma will feature in it or will she be a minor character at that point, I'm not sure. But I will carry on. That's my plan. I'm not through with them yet.
Oh, that's good news for your fans, and I know you do have fans.
Thanks. Yes, my family really does love it. Yeah, those fans certainly do.
And for those of you who are joining us late, we're talking with award-winning author Lee Doty about her newly released book, Last Casualty. It's a sequel to her first novel, Title Kin. And Title Kin took place on Cape Cod. There's the book. And Last Casualty set in West Virginia. Is there a reason for that change, or is that because of where you physically spend your time?
Well, logic would suggest that, yes, when we moved from the Cape to West Virginia, so did Norma and her husband, Coyne. But on the other hand, once we arrived in West Virginia and I visited the battlefield, I knew that the story had to involve that battlefield. And, you know, frankly, what better place for a murder than a place called Bloody Lane? I mean, it was just asking for this story. So, you know, largely it was the fact that we had moved, and it gave me the opportunity to sort of discover West Virginia at the same time that my characters were exploring West Virginia. So that was kind of an interesting phenomenon. But also it had to be the Antietam Battlefield that had to play a role, as well as the history.
Tell us about the history of Bloody Lane. I had a lot of history during my education, and I had never heard of this.
Yeah.
So
well,
please share that story.
Sure. Well, Bloody Lane was originally, is still called Sunken Road, and it was simply a deep ditch across the battlefield where farmers would cart their wheat, their crop, from one end to the other of the field. But during the battle, Bloody Lane was one of the most important battles, and certainly one of the bloodiest. The Confederate soldiers decided that they would be at a great vantage point if they could tuck themselves down into this ditch and wait for the Union soldiers to come forward, and then they could, you know, nail them, you know, in a very close range, like 3 feet away. And that is exactly what happened. The Union soldiers came, just line after line of them, for 3 solid hours. And with each line of troops that came to the sunken road, the Confederate soldiers mowed them down, until the point where the Confederate soldiers were actually doomed by their own strategy. They had no room to maneuver, and they were overwhelmed by the force of the Union soldiers. They had no way to escape. And, you know, there are sort of horrifying depictions of Bloody Lane if you've ever seen photographs, and there were many photographs. This is the sort of the first time when war and its casualties were photographed, but just bodies laid upon bodies. And one soldier said that you could walk all the way across Bloody Lane without your foot ever touching the ground because of all the bodies. So it was just a horrific, horrific battle. But as I believe Norma says it in the book, and also I felt that being down in that ditch, and you can just, you know, get right down in it, you can really experience what that must have been like, in a sense of, you know, watching the soldiers come toward you and mowing them down, and just the horror of it all, the ear-shattering noise of it all. That's the story of Bloody Lane.
Yeah, and devastating, absolutely. Devastating. But I think it's history that should be learned too, hopefully never to be repeated.
Hopefully.
You have several very interesting and other important characters, such as Misty Bubb, Evelyn Spencer, and you've talked a little bit about Sheriff Law. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about these characters, sure, and also how you came up with these interesting names.
Oh, well, you know, the great thing about these secondary characters is, in writing the story, you know, you can work with them a while and then you can leave them to the side. It's not like your protagonist who's sort of with you all the way through. So you can be a little bit creative and pull them in. So they're lots of fun. Sheriff Law is loosely based on a retired sheriff of our Jefferson County here in West Virginia, who also helped me with some of the law enforcement issues in the area. But my Sheriff Law character is easily underestimated. He's got sort of a folksy way about him, doesn't always appear too bright, but all the while his mind is going, and he's willing to bend the rules, but he certainly always has Norma's back, and is a real good guy. Also has a real sense of humor. So I always enjoyed putting Sheriff Law and Norma together, and he shows up in the third book as well. Evelyn Spencer makes her first appearance as a very refined, sophisticated wife of an executive for a large pharmaceutical company. And she's the mother of the murder victim. And she is arrogant, and she also despises Norma, fearing that Norma had something to do with her daughter's death. So they really clash. But the relationship changes over the course of the story. And that also was a rewarding character to write about. I enjoy writing about, well, any friendship, any relationship, but particularly between Norma and any other woman because she's so fractious that it's kind of interesting to work that out. Now, Misty Bub. There's a Misty in every woman's life, and this is not a good thing. Misty is very sexy and lovely and can do everything quite well. And everyone's husband seems to agree with that assessment. And so this can put the wife's nose out of joint. And indeed, that happens in this story. Misty is a large animal veterinarian, and she takes care of the horses on the horse farm where Norma and Will Coyne now live, and she stirs up a bit of trouble. As for where the names come from, well, Sheriff Law, you know, in a state where the governor's name is Justice, I mean, Sheriff Law was sort of inevitable. And Misty Bub, Misty, that name came from a lawyer once called my office, and at the time I had an assistant whose name was Misty. And the lawyer, a man, called my office and he said, Lee, would you mind introducing me to Misty? I can't imagine anyone other than a goddess with a name like Misty. So I felt the mini goddess in my story had to be named Misty. And as for Evelyn Spencer, that just seemed like sort of a patrician-like name, and I wanted her to come across that way. But as is revealed later on in the story, she is actually of West Virginia origin, and she had a humble background. So in any case, but I enjoyed those secondary characters a lot.
Well, they do add to the story. They really do. I know that you have been writing for quite some time, and I know that every writer has their own methods of writing habits. So what kind of advice can you give to future authors and maybe people who are currently writing novels now? Tell us about your writing habits and what advice you can give to others.
Okay. Well, I can tell you what works for me. Let me put it that way. You know, one of the hardest things being a writer is actually sitting down and writing. It's easy to think about, or not easy, but it's easier to think about it and plan it, strategize, outline, whatever. But to actually sit down and write is a real struggle much of the time. And one of the things I do to overcome that struggle is to come up with some rewards, and they are usually of a food nature. Or if I'm going to have a real hard time with a difficult part in my story and I'm avoiding it, that's a chocolate cake situation. If I sit down for a couple of hours and really work at it, I reward myself with some chocolate cake with chocolate from our local bakery. So that is one thing I do. Another thing, I find that I'm in 2 writing groups. And as you mentioned, Kathy, I teach in the lifelong learning program. And these activities keep me up on my game. I do have to prepare. I do critique others' work. I do have to read a fair amount about the craft of writing, as well as, having to write. And then also I'm in a book group, and of course, I get to read and discuss books. And so all of those things play a part in helping me be a writer. But one thing that has really served me well, or at least it's something that gives me confidence, is a book that was written by Francine Prose called Reading Like a Writer. And what she advocates is reading the great works very closely, even copying whole paragraphs from the great works, and then stealing from them, copying the style or the manner of all of them, and working it into your own craft. And I have found that when I've actually taken the time to do that, whether it's with the short stories of Anton Chekhov or, who else? John le Carré is a great writer, but in the mystery spy thriller genre. Something happens to my own writing and I enjoy it more. It just sounds better to me. So that's always been enjoyable, but I think that the advice that's I always hear given is perfectly true, and that is, if you write what you love reading about, it's going to be more fun. And certainly I love mysteries. I love mysteries and thrillers and legal thrillers. So that's what I do. And so far it's working.
It's definitely working. Lee, we just lost your video. I don't know if you can bring that back on to us, please. If she can hear us too. Well, we'll give Lee just a moment to get back online with us. For those of you who may have joined late, this Zoom Into Books video will be available on the Zoom Into Books YouTube channel and on the Zoom Into Books Facebook page. And there's Lee, she's back with us. And it'll be on the Headline Books Facebook page too. And Lee, we want to thank you so much for coming. I have one more question for you that I ask all the authors, because you now have 2 books out. Tell us your most memorable book experience, whether it was at an event or speaking. When you think about your book and all the wonderful things that have happened, what's the one that comes to mind?
Oh, you want a wonderful experience or memorable?
Oh, let's have one of each.
Oh, okay. Well, in retrospect, this is a funny experience, but at the time it was embarrassing. I was at a master class, and a very famous writer was critiquing everyone's work, and she was being very gentle and kind and so on. And she came to my book, and I had some excerpt from Title Kin, Norma Bergen. And someone else in the group had asked a question about, can you really have an unlikable protagonist and be successful with your book? And this head of the master class, this very famous writer, said, well, I'll tell you what I do when I come upon an unlikable protagonist. I throw the book across the room. I don't finish it. And that was it. That was the end of the discussion about my book. So that was an embarrassing situation. That was a very embarrassing situation. Well, one of my happiest memories of a book experience was reading with my sister. We both read we were reading from a play that she wrote that ultimately was performed at the Kennedy Center. And we were each able to take a role, and it was just a lot of fun, very rewarding. It overcame, you know, all sorts of sibling mischief that we had been through as children, and it just was a very warm, heartwarming experience. And it was a great story, great play.
Oh, that's wonderful. That is a great experience.
Really
well, we have come to the end of our time. Please tell people how they can get your book and how they can get in touch with you. I know that you do virtual and in-person visits.
Yes, I do.
And you do speaking engagements. So give us that information.
Sure. Well, you can buy both books at Headline Books, at their website, as well as from Amazon and at local bookstores in Shepherdstown and in the environs. As far as speaking engagements, yes, I travel far and wide, and I love to do in-person talks and virtual talks as well. So you can get in touch with me on my Facebook writers page, authors page, which is Mooncusser Doty. And I look forward to hearing from any of you, all of you. Thank you.
And you can also get in touch with all the Headline Books authors through the headlinebooks.com website too. Lee, thank you so much for joining us today. We wish you the best success with Last Casualty. Lee will be in person with Headline Books at the Preston County Buckwheat Festival at the end of September in Kingwood, West Virginia. She will also be featured at the West Virginia Book Festival in Charleston, West Virginia in October. And hopefully she will be with us in Charlotte, North Carolina at the Southern Christmas Show in November. We're so happy to be able to get back to in-person shows. We have a lot of fun in the booth, and we hope you'll come and meet the authors and enjoy the new books. We have a lot of new releases this year. So thank you everyone for joining us on Facebook, and we hope you'll come back soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, everyone.